unbelievable because the name of our next lecture is Reckless or Pioneering Public Health Genetic Services in Israel. And it will ask the question, are we reckless or pioneering? So it's very, very relevant. And the speaker will be Professor Aviad, who is a full professor at the Department of Sociology. Aviad, you can come. You're sitting there?
I need you here for the mic.
Can you hear
No,
me
for
without
the
the mic?
recording. For the recording.
I need to see the presentation.
You can see it on the screen.
It doesn't work for me with
with
the screen. I need to see it on the big screen.
We can attach it here.
מה האופציה?
שים את המיקרופון הצמוד לתא שלך ותשב שם.
אוקיי.
So, meanwhile, I will tell you who Professor Aviad is. Aviad Raz is. Full professor at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Gurion University, Israel, where he is chair of the MA program. Aviad was a visiting professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of California, San Diego, and a visiting scholar at Sciences Po in the University of Louvain. He has written 9 books and over 60 articles and chapters and topics in organizational and medical sociology and anthropology. His recent books include Comparative Empirical Bioethics, Dilemmas of Genetic Testing and Euthanasia in Israel and Germany, with Zilke Schiktans, and Cousin Marriages Between Tradition, Genetic Risk, and Cultural Change, with Alison Shaw. His current research projects focus on newborn screening, NIPT, what we've just heard about, and collective representation in patient organizations.
Thank you very much, Yael. Can you all hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. So, thank you for having me, and I will start by thanking the center and the organizers, because this presentation actually derives from a book chapter that you encouraged me to write. So, and the book about bioethics in Israel is going to be published soon, so we are all waiting for that. My talk is going to be about community genetics, which I find is a unique way of doing public health genetics services in Israel. People have spoken about Israel as a startup nation in the context of high tech. I think that Israel is also a startup nation in the context of community genetics, and I've written down some of the examples of that. Israel has a national program for carrier testing of adult people. It is supposed to be preconceptional, but most people don't do it preconceptionally, do not go and test themselves preconceptionally, because preconceptional is a term used by geneticists. Most of us don't know when are we going to be preconceptional. Usually it's something that happens along with life. So actually the testing takes place during pregnancy, so it becomes prenatal. And this is something that targets the broader population, but actually I would say the secular public, because the secular Jewish public, because for ultra-Orthodox Jews there is a separate screening program called Dor Yeshorim, and I will talk about it more later. And then there are special screening programs for the various ethnic communities in Israel, such as Arab Israelis, Druze, Bedouin populations, all of them with high prevalence of mutations and of consanguinity. And last but not least, Israel has a national database of mutations classified. So I will also talk about classification. Classified according to ethnic and religious categories, which is unique in the world. It's called the Golden Helix. I need to situate what I call community genetics in between two much more recognized and general forms of genetics services. On the one hand, public health genetics, on the other hand, clinical genetics. Public health genetics is the mainstream model developed in the US, then incorporated in Europe, and also with a lot of influence on Israel. It is pan-ethnic, universal. The premise is that one panel of tests fits all. And it is based on the premise not to stigmatize, to avoid ethnic profiling. And in the US, this goes back to the traumatic experience of the sickle cell screening of African Americans in the 70s, the infamous experience where because of the higher prevalence of sickle cell mutation in the African American community and lack of public understanding about the meaning of being a carrier, this population was targeted for screening and as a result was stigmatized, and it had repercussions in terms of employability, in terms of health insurance, so on and so forth. Offering genetic screening on an ethnic basis became a taboo in the US. It became equivalent to ethnic profiling, which is a term used in the context of terrorism and home security. And examples of public health genetics are newborn screening and Down syndrome screening, both conducted in the context of the entire population, pan-ethnic, universal. Sometimes it has to do with age, but never with ethnicity. Clinical genetics, on the other hand, it focuses on the person. So when the person brings with him or her also family history, community history, ethnic history, this might become relevant and pertinent to counseling. So we have here a quote by Leo Tenkate, who is one of the founding fathers of the School of Community Genetics. He founded the unit of community genetics in the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, which is the only one of its kind in Europe. And he also founded a journal called Community Genetics, which was about 8 years or so, was changed, and the title was changed to Public Health Genetics, and the editorship was taken from Leo and given to public health scientists from the US. So it's also a political story, but I will not get into that. You can see from this quote that public health and genetics and clinical genetics may be in conflict. So community genetics could be offered as a kind of a golden path between the two, or a kind of a resolution. Is it? That's a question we will need to ask ourselves. throughout this presentation. So why did community genetics become so widely practiced in the Israeli context? Historically, we could connect it to the so-called community medicine approach, championed by people like Sidney Clark in Hadassah in Jerusalem and also others. We can trace it to the early successful implementation in the 60s, to a community project to control hemophilia in Cyprus. We can trace it to the fact that Ashkenazi Jews as a community are the #1 genetically researched group in the world, promoting a collective sense of genetic risk for providers and users, which may explain what CP was referring to as the very tentative pregnancy in Israel because of the shared concept of risk. We can trace the way that community genetics has been developed in Israel to the influence of Judaism, both in terms of constraints and of support. But I don't have time to go into that, and I'm sure David will talk about it. And we can talk about the routine utilization by medical doctors, medical professionals of the ethnic characteristics as part of medical service. Consider, in contrast, that in Europe or in the US, a doctor is not allowed to ask a patient about his ethnic background. So it boils down to an interesting question, I think, whether what happens in Israel is reckless, as some might say, or pioneering. And I will talk about 2 examples. I will talk about them in general. I will not bring in detail the ethnographic studies that have been done, also by myself. But I will stick to the general level of presentation. And I've chosen these 2 examples because they are interconnected. The golden helix is the site of data, of diagnosis, whereas projects of healthy consanguinity are the site of intervention. But the 2 are obviously interconnected because you cannot intervene without having the diagnosed mutations. A few admonitions before we take the plunge. Why do we have to worry? Taking the community perspective has become a part of the medical and professional and academic discourse concerning genetic services in the last 10 years at least or so. It has become part of the discourse in the US as well, where public health scientists warn us that, and I quote, there are fundamental conceptual challenges here. First, we need to define the community. This is not to be taken for granted, something that anthropologists have been saying the world for a long time. So what kind of community we're talking about, what are its borders, so on. The legitimacy of community consent and representation. So when a medical scientist or a geneticist decides to bring a genetic test into a specific community which is defined as being at risk according to genetic criteria, what do we have to do in order to ask the community first? what kind of procedural justice is involved, what kind of informed consent is involved, and which community voices should be solicited and should be heard, because there could be a variety of voices depending on whether we listen to those who have a given condition, or to those who have a family history of a given condition, or to those who belong to the community but do not see themselves as being at risk. So this is the welcome page of the Golden Helix. And I see that some of you have seen it already. And it's interesting in the way that it is laid out. And it says the largest groups in Israel are Ashkenazi Jews, originated from Eastern and Central Europe. If you bear in mind the definition of the community, some would contest this definition already at this point. And then it says most of the Arabs and Druze populations living in villages, small towns, a strong tradition of marriages within the family. And what you can do in this website is you can use the pull-down menu to specify what kind of ethnic or religious category you're interested in. So you can select Jews, Christians, Muslim. You can select ethnicity, and then you can search for the mutations that are prevalent within this category. And I cannot think of any similar database around the world. But is it wrong to build such a database and to use it? I think that the question becomes sharper when we look at the interventions that are being based on such a database. So some of these interventions take place in the context of consanguineous communities, where the prevalence of mutation combined with cousin marriage accentuates the chance or the risk, depending on whom you ask, of having a child with a genetic disease. To situate these interventions, these community genetics programs, we need to take a look at views of consanguinity. And I'll do it very quickly. Speaking of paradigm change, I think we have here at least three major phases. 19th century, not so long ago, but very long ago perhaps, there was a great tradition of consanguinity. In Victorian England, this was a status signal for the upper classes, and the pictures here are of course of Charles Darwin's and his wife. Darwin was married to his cousin. And then became modern medicine, 20th century, the discovery of genetics, and the modern medical view of consanguinity was negative, fueled by immigration politics, because many times those communities that continue to practice traditional forms of consanguinity even after they have immigrated to Europe. And I will not continue this sentence because it becomes politically sensitive, but you can imagine the continuation. So this has led to a widespread, almost taken for granted, public framing of consanguinity as increased genetic risk. But interestingly, not in Israel. where geneticists speak about healthy consanguinity. The following slide illustrates what I mean by the medical view of consanguinity and its alarmist public discourse. In 2012, The Guardian published a big story with the alarmist title, "Marriage Between First Cousins Doubles Risk of Birth Defects," say researchers. And when we hear that it doubles risk, of course, this is very alarming. But when we look at the actual data, this is taken from a study called Born in Bradford. Bradford is home to one of the largest British Pakistani communities in the UK. And they practice, many of them practice consanguinity. So the actual data showed that when you look at the consanguineous population in general, the level of risk was actually equivalent to the general level of risk for having a child with a genetic disease in the general population, which is between 2 and 3%. When you looked specifically at a consanguineous couple, or consanguineous couple that has a family history of genetic diseases, especially recessive diseases, then the risk increased to 4 to 6%, so double the risk. But when you say 4 to 6% in contrast to 2 to 3%, it sounds much more less alarming. And when you consider that the risk for women over 35 is the same, then it puts things in perspective. And I think no one would dare launch a campaign against women over 35 having children, in the same way that some campaigns have been launched against consanguinity as a public health problem, even in the US. So how much time? Okay. So the policy, the community genetics policy in Israel has been not to preach against consanguinity. The premise was that this is too much of a tradition in these communities, that if we were to tell these people not to marry their cousins or not to marry within the community, this would not work. This would backfire at us. Rather, promote prenatal and premarital genetic screening, and this happens among ultra-Orthodox Jews, Arab Israelis, Druze, and Bedouin, which are defined as being at risk by the geneticists, and the resulting intervention is called healthy consanguinity. Why is there a problem? Let me take you back to the admonitions that I mentioned before. So, have we defined the community? Who did this definition, and is it legitimate? Some of these community-based programs are now drifting to nearby communities. For example, the Dor Yeshorim program, it now tries to expand itself to the modern religious community with a lot of unexpected consequences that I don't have time to talk about. Was there community consent and representation? Which community voices were heard? So if we look at Dor Yeshorim, maybe the most successful, the most heard about program, I would say none of these questions would receive a positive reply. So in conclusion, Israel practices community genetics. Whether it's reckless or pioneering depends on one's perspective. We have been accused, Israel, was accused by several bioethicists, especially from Europe. So I'm quoting here Pascal Bory, who is also a good friend, wrote a paper titled "Look Before You Leap," targeting Israel as an eccentric, reckless state, which is doing all these genetic tests without justification. In some other cases, Israel is leading the way. We can see examples of other countries that followed the model of Israel. One last point to consider, maybe a critical point to consider that I would mention, is that all these community genetics programs that I mentioned were designed for the sake of prevention only, preventing genetic disease. None has been designed for care. Thank you.